In this tutorial, I'm going to show you 32 different procedural textures that I came up with that use the wave texture as the base. The first few textures are going to be pretty basic, but then after that I'm going to introduce more nodes and really increase the complexity of the patterns. Some of these I did create on purpose, but many were the result of just experimentation and just seeing what I could plug into where. And I'm going to include the timestamps of all the textures in the description, so if you want to jump around to any of the textures you can. Since it's a long video, I think that's the best way to do it. You can just watch one texture if you want. You don't have to watch all of them. That being said, I am going to start each texture with a simple setup of a wave texture and two mix RGBs, and I'm going to set that up at the beginning of the tutorial in the first texture. So make sure to at least watch that one so you can see how those are set up.
Let's start by deleting our default cube, and we'll bring in a plane. I'm going to change my entire middle window to the shader editor and hit N to get rid of that shelf on the right. Then I'm going to come up here and change this to the 3D viewport. Scroll across the top and get rid of these overlays so we can see our object a little bit better, and hold down Z, move my mouse up to go into rendered mode there. I'm going to go ahead and click on this drop down menu here so we can see that material that was on our default cube, and I'm just going to rename this Toot Matte. I'm going to get rid of this principled shader here and bring in a wave texture. You need Node Wrangler enabled to be able to do this shortcut. It's Control Shift left click, and it just shows the nodes effect on the output over here. I'm going to change the scale to 1. And while this node is highlighted as well, I'm going to hit Control T. That brings up the texture coordinate mapping node. Just make sure object is plugged into vector there. I'm going to go ahead and bring in two mix RGBs here and change these to color burn and color dodge. I'm going to set the color 2 on the color burn to black and the color 2 on the color dodge to white. And now I'm going to zoom in and just show you what these are doing. The color burn, you move that back and forth. It controls the thickness of the black there. And then the color dodge, you move that back and forth. It controls the amount of gradient, how much fall off it has. So if this is all the way to the left, it's quite a lot of gradient. If it's all the way to the right, there's absolutely no gradient. So two useful tools there, just handy little setup, color burn, color dodge there. By the way, this is the node setup for texture 1. It's just the basic vertical stripes. For texture 2, we're actually not going to change that much. What we're going to do is we're going to come to the mapping node and change this Z rotation value to 45. And then if we look up here, we have diagonal lines. Just to note here, we could also do this kind of a different way. If we came over to the wave texture and we changed this second value to diagonal, it kind of does the same thing. It's just these diagonal lines, so there you go. And one more thing too about this right here, the sign. So it basically means it has a gradient on both sides of the line there. If we change this to saw, it has no gradient on one side and a gradient on the other side. And then if we change this to triangle, it's two gradients again, but the interpolation, instead of being like a curve, is a straight line. So you'll see that when we do more complex things with this wave texture, but just keep that in mind. This is kind of the interpolation. So this is the setup for texture 2. The third texture, I'm going to go ahead and change this back to 0 for the rotation and add in a gradient node. Let's go ahead and search for that and just put it right after the mapping node. I'm going to change this to spherical. And there we have our third texture. It's kind of like a target or something like that. To get texture 4, we come to this gradient texture and change spherical to quadratic sphere. This is kind of similar, but it looks like the inner bands are a little bit thinner than the outer bands. While we're on the topic of procedural circles made from this wave texture, I just want to talk about something else here as well. Just another way to get a circular pattern. Let's remove this gradient and plug vector into vector, and instead of bands, let's check out rings, and let's check out spherical, just like this. So then we can adjust this part here and just get different patterns there. But just another way to get a circular pattern, just rings and spherical, just like that. For texture 5, we're going to change something on the gradient node again. We're going to change it to radial this time. And you can see we've got this radial shape in the top right, but one of these sections is bigger than these other two sections. To fix that, I'm going to set the scale to 1.25. 1.25 or a multiple of it, like let's say times 2, looks pretty good. So anyways, times 2, this is our fifth texture here. For texture 6, what we're going to do is we're going to still do this radiating pattern, but we're just going to move this origin point to the bottom left. So if we move this mapping node, we can move this origin point back and forth. Turns out if we set both of these x and y values at 1, it goes into the corner there. So that's an easy way to do it. We've got it down here. We could raise this up if we wanted, you know, to times 2 to 5 or something like that, but this is texture 6. So for texture 7, let's go ahead and reset this mapping data here. Just change these both to 0 so our origin is in the middle again. And then on the wave texture, let's change the scale to 10 so our pattern's a little smaller. Let's come over here to right after the texture coordinate and add a noise texture. Just place it on this noodle, set the scale to 2. Then we're going to bring in a mix RGB and put it right afterwards and run object into color 2. So now we've got a controller right here that controls how much influence this noise texture has on the gradient. If it's all the way to the right, it's like this noise texture isn't even here. And if it's all the way to the left, you know, it's probably too much. So let's put it at 0.7 there. We notice this actually changed the center of our pattern. So I'm going to fix that by adding a second mix RGB and changing this to subtract. And you just need to make sure that both of these factors add up to 1. So since this is 0.7, I'm going to change this second one to 0.3. But it's not super convenient. You know, you'd have to change this to 0.8 and then change this to 0.2. So rather than adjusting 2 parameters, I'm going to add 2 extra nodes to help me synchronize them. And that is a value node and a math node. I'm just going to change this to subtract and change the top value to 1. I'm going to change this to 0.7 and plug this right into the first factor. Then I'm going to plug this into the bottom value on that math node. And basically this is saying 1 minus whatever number I put here is going to come out of here. So I'm going to plug that into this factor on the subtract. Now if I move this back and forth, you know, it just updates both at the same time. So you want to keep this between 0 and 1. And because it goes kind of fast, you actually want to hold down shift when you do this one here, when you move it back and forth. So I'm going to set this at 0.7 and that looks, you know, it's actually 0.88, and that is texture 7. For texture 8, I've got my wave texture, color burn, and color dodge set up that I set up at the beginning of the video. I'm just going to change the scale to 2.5, just like that. I'm going to hit Control T with this wave texture highlighted and make sure it's running out of object into the vector on the mapping node. And I'm just going to add in a gradient texture right after the mapping node and change this to radial. I'm going to create another wave texture and just put it right after this texture coordinate node here and create a mix RGB node and just run object into color 2. We're going to do kind of something similar that we did last time, where this is just set at 0.88 and we've got another mix RGB set to subtract set at 0.12. And I'm just going to have this update automatically with a value node and a math node here. So set this at 0.88 and add in a math node and set this to subtract. Then run this into the bottom one, change the top one to 1, run this into the first factor, and run this into the second factor, just like that. Let's come over here to the wave texture, change this from bands to rings, from X to spherical, and from sine to triangle, just like that. And let's come over here to the scale and change this to 1. And there we have, that's texture 8. Let's take a look at texture 9 now. Again, I've got my wave texture, my color burn, and color dodge, like I set up at the beginning. And I'm going to just click on the wave texture and hit Control T and make sure this is coming out of object. And then I'm going to place a Voronoi on the vector line here and just set up a mix RGB right afterwards. Make sure this is coming out of distance, going into color 1, and then plug object into color 2. We're going to set this factor at 0.9. Then we're going to come down here and put a gradient right before this wave texture here. This is going to be a radial gradient. Let's come back to this Voronoi and set the scale to 3 and set this Euclidean to Manhattan, just like that. And then what we're going to do, because this is slightly off center, is we're going to add one more mix and set this to subtract, and then set up a value and math node so that both those factors add up to 1. Just like this here, and change this to subtract, put the value into the bottom value on that math node, and change this top value to 1. Plug this bottom part in here, change this to 0.9, and then plug this output of the subtract into the factor of that subtract down here. Then let's come down to the end where we've got this color burn and set this factor to 0.96, just like that. And there we go. We've got texture number 9. Next, let's take a look at texture 10. I'm going to start by adjusting this scale here, not to 10, I'm going to change it the other way, actually to 2.5, and click on this wave texture and hit Control T. Brings up this texture coordinate mapping node. Make sure this is coming out of object here. And I'm going to add a gradient texture right here and change it to radial, just like that. I'm going to make some room for some stuff here. First of all, I'm going to bring in another gradient texture, and I'm going to plug this in from object and change this to quadratic sphere. Let's see what that's doing. So far so good. Let's add in a color ramp next and just place it right afterwards. And then let's go ahead and actually plug this into the rotation on this mapping node. Let's view this again and just see what's happening. So we're starting to get a little bit of a spiral, and I want more of a spiral. So I'm going to bring in what's called a vector math node here. And this just allows you to compute 3 variables there instead of just like a regular math node, which is just 1 variable. So I'm going to change this to multiply and change this last value here, the z value, to 5. And now we can see a lot more rotation. So the other problem we have is the rotation kind of stops before it gets to the edge of the image. So what we can do actually is another vector multiply node can be placed before this gradient texture node. And I'm just going to set these all to 0 again and change the x and the y to 0.6. And then let's see what that's doing. It's just basically making this so it's a little further out, widening the gradient so it doesn't end before the edge of the image. And so we can use that, and that basically sets up our spiral there. So this is texture 10, but for bonus points you can come down here and adjust this color ramp. Let's put in a couple more colors there. Make sure this is a little darker, and start moving these around. And you can see every time I go from gray to a slightly darker gray, it creates that spiral image. So you could do this a couple times and create some pretty cool spiral images there, like we have in the top right. Let's take a look at texture 11. So I've got my wave texture and color burn and color dodge, and I'm going to set my scale to 0.5, just like that. Click on this wave texture, hit Control T so it brings up the texture coordinate mapping node, and make sure this is coming out of object. I'm going to click on this wave texture and hit Control Shift D. And that duplicates the wave texture, but it also keeps it attached to the mapping node, which is useful. And I'm going to come down here and change X to Y, just like that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Control and Shift and right click and drag from the top wave texture to the bottom one, and it creates this mix for me here. So just going to make sure that the output is plugged into color 1 there, and not like that there. So let's come over to the mix and change this to multiply, and then let's change this factor to 0.9, just like that. Let's come over to the factor on the color burn and change this to 0.07. Come over here to the color dodge and turn this up to 1. Lastly, let's bring in a color ramp and let's put it right after this bottom wave texture. Let's go ahead and flip the color ramp and bring the black down to 0.7, just like that. We've got our texture. It's texture 11. Let's change this interpolation just to see what other options we might have. For instance, B-spline. If we zoom in, we can see these edges are kind of rounded there. And then if we did constant, it'd be all super square, just like that. So let's change this back to ease. Let's take a look at texture 12 now. I'm going to come over to this wave texture and set the scale to 0.3. And click on this wave texture and hit Control T. Bring up this texture coordinate mapping node and make sure it's coming out of object, going into that mapping there. I'm going to move this texture coordinate over and bring in a noise texture and place it right here and change the scale to 7. I'm going to bring in a mix RGB, place it right afterwards, and make sure object is going into color 2. I'm going to set this factor quite high at 0.97, just like that. Come down to this area here, and I'm actually going to bring in a brick texture and make sure vector is going into vector there. We're going to set the scale at 2, just like that. We're going to mix these two together and move these over a little bit so we have a bit more room. And let's set this mix at 0.62, just like that. Let's set this factor on the color burn at 0.4, and then drag this factor all the way to 1. And there we have texture 12. Let's take a look at texture 13 now. On my wave texture, I'm going to set this scale to 1. Then while it's clicked on, hit Control T, and it brings up the texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and make sure it's coming out of object. I'm then going to click on this wave texture and hit Control Shift D to duplicate it while the noodle is still attached. And let's come down here. Let's change this to Y. Let's change this this scale, pardon me, to 0.6, and then this distortion to 80, just like that. And then let's go ahead and let's plug this into the factor. Let's change this to a 0.5 gray, just like that. And then let's come over here, just drag this all the way to the right. And there we have texture 13. Let's take a look at texture 14 now. I'm going to click on this wave texture, set this to saw right here, and set the scale to 1. Then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control T and make sure this is coming out of object, and click on this wave and hit Control Shift D so we can attach it while it's still there. And then on this bottom one, let's change this to diagonal and leave that at saw. Let's come over here and plug this into the factor, and then come over here and change this to white, or to 1 on the color dodge there with the white. And there we go. We've got texture 14. Let's take a look at texture 15. I'm going to change this scale on the wave texture to 1, and then while it's highlighted, hit Control T and make sure this is coming out of object going into vector. Then I'm going to duplicate this wave texture with Control Shift D so that it's still attached. And I'm going to change this bottom one to diagonal, and then leave it on sign. Leave everything else the same. I'm just going to plug this into the factor. And then I'm going to do one more thing, which is add in a gradient texture right before this bottom wave texture, and change this to quadratic sphere, just like that. Then I'm going to come over here and change this factor to 1. And there we have texture 15. Let's take a look at texture 16. What I'm going to do first is I'm just going to change the scale on this wave texture to 2.5. Then I'm going to hit Control T on this wave texture here and bring up this texture coordinate and mapping node and plug object into vector. And then I'm just going to move these over a little bit here. Let's duplicate this wave texture with Control Shift D so it's still attached to that mapping node. And then I'm going to mix these two together before we get to that color burn. I'm going to set the scale of this mix to 0.5. I guess it's just set there, so I'll leave it. I'm going to change the scale of the bottom wave texture to 1, and then I'm going to come over to these noodles after the mapping nodes and put a gradient texture on each of them, just like this. I'm going to change the top one to radial, and the bottom one I'm going to change to spherical. And then I'm going to come over here to the color dodge and set this to 0.9, just to give that less of a fall off. This is a really cool texture, though. I really enjoyed playing around with this one. Really happy when I stumbled across it. I encourage you to try adjusting some of these parameters, just seeing what you get, because you can get some really interesting geometric patterns by playing around with some of these settings here. Change the interpolation or whatever. Just some really cool stuff in this shader. So I encourage you to try this one especially. But this is texture 16. This is texture 17. I'm going to highlight this wave texture and hit Control T and make sure object is going into vector there. I'm going to change this scale to 2.5. I'm going to move this texture coordinate and mapping node just over here a little bit, and let's duplicate this wave texture with Control Shift D so it's still attached to that mapping node. Then let's mix these two together. So this just creates a mix RGB. Move these over a bit, give myself more room. Let's open that up. Let's come down to the bottom wave texture and let's change the scale to 2, the distortion to 20, the detail to 8, the detail scale to 0.1, and the detail roughness to 1. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a gradient onto both of these noodles again here, just right here before that wave texture, and right here before that one, and then set this top one to radial and this bottom one to spherical. And there we go. We've got texture 17. Let's change this fall off here actually at the end. Let's just change this to 1, just like that. Gives it a bit sharper of a look. This one's kind of interesting to play around with. You can play around with this scale down here on the bottom wave texture, for instance, and get some pretty cool, interesting geometric patterns that emerge here. So, pretty interesting procedural texture. Let's take a look at texture 18 next. We'll set the scale to 2.5 and click on this wave and hit Control T, plug object into vector. Let's duplicate this wave while keeping it attached by hitting Control Shift D. And then let's change the bottom one to saw and then change the scale to 2. What we're going to do is mix these two together by holding Control Shift and right clicking and dragging from one wave texture to the other. And then I'm just going to move these guys over a little bit, give us some more room, and open this one up here. Then let's go ahead and add 2 gradients onto just these areas right before these wave textures here. We're going to change the top one to radial and the bottom one to spherical, just like that. Let's come over here to the mix and set this to 0.4 and drag this factor on the color dodge all the way to 1. And there we go. We've got texture 18. Let's take a look at this texture for a moment. I'm going to change this bottom scale to 0.6 just so this is a little easier to see. And I'm going to pull this to the left, and we can see that this radial gradient texture with the wave texture is producing this radial texture on the top right, and then this bottom one, if I pull it to the right, we can see that set up with the spherical gradient texture is producing these circles. So it's just kind of interesting, keep an eye on this top right as I drag it across. You can see it just basically, the black parts come down and touch the other black parts, and then they slowly become more and more like this image. It's much easier to see than it normally is just on a simplified image like this. So you can kind of see how these images in the middle is just some kind of combination between the two of them. So yeah, just worth pointing out, I thought. Let's check out texture 19. Got my wave texture. I'm going to set the scale quite low at 0.62 and hit Control T, bring in my texture coordinate mapping node, making sure this is coming out of object there. Then I'm going to go ahead and bring in a checker texture. So just put that down here. Make sure vector is plugged into vector from that mapping node as well. Now let's go ahead and mix these two together. I'm just going to move everything over to the right, give myself more space, and open this up. I'm going to change this to multiply and change this to 0.9, just like that. I'm going to come over to the factor, change this to 0.7, and nope, 0.07. That's what I meant there. Now let's go ahead and drag this over to the right to 1. Come to the checker texture and just change the scale to 4. And then let's put a color ramp in just after this checker texture as well, just to control this a little bit more. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move the black to 0.76. I'm going to move the white down to 0.26, just like that. So if we control these, it controls the size of those to a certain extent, those little pieces that jut out. It's just a way to have a little bit more control anyways with that color ramp. But this is texture 19. Let's check out texture 20. I'm going to change this scale to 2.5 and hit Control T while this wave texture is highlighted. Make sure this is coming out of object there. Just move this over a little bit here. I'm going to duplicate this wave using Control Shift D so it's still attached to that mapping node there. I'm going to put a gradient texture on both of these noodles right after that mapping node. I'm going to change the top to radial and the bottom to spherical, just like that. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix these two together, just like this. And let's move this over. Something weird happened here. I'm just going to plug the mix into color 1 there. Let's set this at 0.57, just like that. Let's come down here, change the scale on the bottom wave texture to 2, and then let's come over here to the vector line, and we're going to add a noise texture right here, and add a mix RGB. Place it right here, and make sure object is going into color 2. Then we're going to do that same setup we've done before, where we just want to correct any off-center origin points here with a value node and a math node. So I'm going to plug this into the bottom one and set this to 1, and come over to this drop down menu and set that to subtract. I'm going to plug this into the mix factor of that first mix node, and then this one into the second one there. So then this one right here, let's set this at 0.4, and this noise will shrink down to 0.5, just like that there. Let's come over to the mix and set this to subtract, and then come down to the end. We're going to pull this factor all the way to 1, and there we have texture 20. Moving on to texture 22, let's go ahead and set this wave texture scale to 2.5 and hit Control T while it's highlighted, and plug object into vector there. Let's move this down a tiny bit, and let's duplicate this wave texture with a Control Shift D command so that keeps it attached there. Then I'm going to bring 2 gradient textures in and put them right here on these noodles. Let's change the top one to radial and the bottom one to spherical. What we'll do is we'll mix these together. Move this stuff over. I'm going to move that over before I do that mix. It always gets in the way. I never learn. Let's unplug this here and just plug this into color 1 there. Let's change this mix to 0.56, just like that there. Then let's come over to the vector line and let's add another wave texture here. Let's add a mix RGB so we can control the factor, and just put it right afterwards and plug object right into color 2. Then what we're going to do is we're going to change this to 0.9, so quite high, but we also want to kind of correct for any imbalance here, so we'll create another mix RGB and change this to subtract, and we're going to do that quick little setup here where we just create a value node and a math node, just like this. Plug the value into the bottom value on the math node and change this to subtract, change this top value to 1. We'll change this to 0.9, which will then just point in, like plug right into 0.9 right here, so it just stays the same. And then what we'll do is basically saying 1 minus 0.9 is going to come out of here, and so that's what we want to kind of average those out and just make it so it's kind of still in the center. Then we'll change this to 3.5 and change this to saw. No, sorry, just change that to diagonal rather, just like that there. Then let's come over to the color burn and set this to 0.04 and drag this across to the right. And there we go, we've got texture 21. Let's check out texture 22. To start out on my wave texture, I'm going to set this to 1 on the scale, and I'm going to hit Control T, and that brings up my texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Then let's go ahead and duplicate this wave texture with Control Shift D, just like that. I'm going to change this bottom one to 0.8. Let's go ahead and move these over a little bit and just add a gradient texture onto each of these noodles after the mapping node. And change this top one to radial and this bottom one to spherical. Let's come over to the vector line and plug object into vector there. And let's bring in a wave texture and plug it in right here. I'm just going to go ahead and move this over and bring in a mix RGB, place that afterwards, and plug object into color 2. Then we're going to bring a second mix RGB here and just set this to subtract so we can keep stuff in the middle there. I'm going to bring in a value node and a math node to keep these values synchronized. Change this to subtract, change the top value to 1, and plug this into the bottom value. Plug this into the second factor and this value node into the first factor, just like that. Let's set this to 0.9, and let's set this to 3.5, just like that. Next, let's come over to these wave textures, and I'm just going to move this over before I mix these this time here, so we have a bit more space. I'm going to open this up and set it to 0.62, just like that. Set this color burn at 0.3, and then drag this factor on the color dodge all the way to 1. And there we go. We've got, texture 22 here. On to texture 23. Let's go ahead and change this wave texture scale to 1. I'm going to hit Control T and bring up a mapping and texture coordinate node. Make sure this is plugged into object. Let's move this over. I'm going to duplicate this wave texture with Control-Shift-D, and then go ahead and mix these together. And look at that, I forgot to move this over. Let's do that, and just open up this mix shader. I'm going to put 2 gradient nodes on these noodles after the mapping node, change this to radial, and then change this bottom one to spherical. I'll set this bottom value on the scale of the wave texture to 0.8, then set this factor. Actually, what we're going to do is plug this bottom wave texture into that factor. Then let's set this factor on the color burn to 0.3, just like that there. Let's come over to this vector line. Let's go ahead and put a wave texture on here. Just like that. Then let's set up a mix RGB and a subtract mix RGB right after that. Just like this here. And then our value and math node to keep those values both adding up to 1. Just like that there. Plug this in here, plug this in here. This value into the first factor. Change this to subtract, change this top value to 1. Then we'll change this value to 0.74, just like that. Then let's go ahead and plug object into color 2 of that first mix RGB. Change this on the wave texture, change it to rings, change it to spherical, and then let's change the scale to 2.8, just like that there. Let's come over to the very end and change this factor on the color dodge to 1. And there we go. We've got texture 23. Let's check out texture 24. This is going to be pretty similar to the last one. I'm going to start by changing the scale on my wave texture to 2.5. Now let's hit Control T, bring up the texture coordinate mapping node, plug it object into the mapping node there, and then let's go ahead and bring, we'll duplicate this here with Control-Shift-D first, then let's bring in a gradient texture for each one of these noodles here. So place one right there and place one right here. Let's change this top one to radial, and this bottom one is going to be set to spherical. Let's go ahead and mix these two together, and I forgot to move these over. Let's do that and open up this mix node so we can see what's going on. We're going to plug this color right into the factor right there. Let's come over to this vector line. Let's add another wave texture as well as our mix RGB setup that I've done for a lot of the other ones in this video. So set that up there, plug object into color 2, and then let's duplicate this and change this to subtract, and then let's set up a value and a math node here as well. We'll change this to subtract here, plug this into the second factor, plug this into the first factor, set this first value to 1, and plug this into the second factor on that subtract there. Let's set this value up here to 0.34, and on this wave texture, let's change this to rings, and then we'll change this part to spherical, and then we'll change it to triangle, and then finally the scale will change to 1.4, just like this here. Let's come over here to the wave texture on the bottom, and we're going to change this scale to 2. Actually, a little bit smaller, to 0.2. There we go. Then let's come over here to the color burn. Let's set this factor at 0.3. And then we'll drag this factor all the way to 1, just like that. And this is texture 24. On to texture 25. Let's take a look at this wave texture, and let's change this scale to 2.5. And let's change this value here, or not that one there, this one here to triangle, just like that. Hit Control T, bring up the texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and plug object into vector there. Now let's go ahead and duplicate this wave texture while hitting Control-Shift-D, and that keeps it attached to that mapping node. Let's take a look at this bottom one and change this to saw, and change the scale to 0.8, just like that. And then let's move these over and we'll mix them together like this here. Open this up. Let's go ahead and put a gradient texture on both of these noodles after the mapping node, and change this top one to radial and this bottom one to spherical, just like that. Then on the vector line, let's add another wave texture here, and then set up a mix RGB so we can control the factor on how much this wave texture is influencing everything. And then let's go ahead and add a value node and a subtract node up here as well to help keep things in the middle. Bring in a math node and change it to subtract, just like this. Set the top value to 1 and plug this into the bottom value. we're going to actually duplicate this mix here as well. I neglected to do that, and change the second value, or the second option here, take off clamp. Change this to subtract, just like this. And this is going to plug into that second factor, and this is going to plug into that first factor. And we're going to set this mix factor at 0.74, just like that. Come on down to the wave texture, and we're going to set this to we're going to set to rings and spherical there, and then saw, and then 1.2, just like this. There we go. Let's come over to the mix after the two wave textures, and let's set this at 0.43. And let's go ahead and drag this color dodge all the way to the right. And there we go. We've got texture 25. This is another one that's kind of interesting to take a look at. Let's just play with this mix factor for a second. So I'm going to drag it to 0. And we can see the influence of this top branch, this gradient with the radial pattern there. And if we drag it all over to the right, we get this spherical gradient with the wave texture. So again, if we drag it into the middle there, you can see it slowly changes from the one pattern to the other. It's just kind of interesting just to see on some of these textures what parts branch out to which areas. It's cool. Let's check out texture 26. I'm going to start by adjusting my scale on my wave texture there to 2.5. And then let's highlight this and hit Control T and plug object into vector there. I'm going to go ahead and click on that wave texture and hit Control Shift D and duplicate it where it's still attached. And I'm going to move this stuff over a little bit here and go ahead and mix these together. Change this to multiply and change the factor to 1, just like that. And change the scale on the bottom to 1.5. I'm going to add a gradient onto each one of these noodles here after the mapping node, just like that. And there we go. And I'm going to change the top one to radial and the bottom one to spherical, just like that. I'm going to come over here to the vector line and add a Voronoi. Place it here, change this to Manhattan, and change the scale to 4. Then I'm going to add a mix RGB and just plug object into color 2 here. Next, let's add on another mix RGB, just put it after this one here, and to change this to subtract. The idea is we want to get these to both equal 1, so to keep them synchronized, I'm going to add in a value node and a math node. Just put it here, change this to subtract, and run the value node into the bottom value, change this top one to 1. Then run this into the second factor and this value into the first factor. We're going to set this at 0.95, just like that. Let's come over here to the color burn, and let's set this at 0.04, and let's drag this factor over to 1. And there we go. We've got texture 26. Let's check out texture 27. I'm going to start by adjusting on my wave texture. Just change the scale to 2.5. Then I'm going to change the distortion to 30. I'm going to click on this and hit T, or Control T, pardon me, and make sure it's coming out of object going into mapping there. Then I'm going to click on this wave texture here, and I'm going to Control Shift D, duplicate it just so it's still attached there. And then I'm going to mix it with this guy here and move this over in retrospect there. Change this to multiply and change this to 0.2, just like this. So I'm going to come down here and change this bottom value to 1.5 and change this distortion to 0, just like that. Let's add a gradient onto each one of these noodles after the mapping node and change this top one to radial and this bottom one to spherical, just like that. Let's come over to the vector line and let's add a Voronoi texture just in between the texture coordinate and mapping node. And then let's bring in a mix RGB and then duplicate it and put it right after as well. Just change this to subtract, and let's move this Voronoi up and plug object into color 2 of this first mix RGB. We're going to add a value and a math node up here just to synchronize everything so we can get both those factors to add up to 1. Subtract, and then plug this into factor of the second factor, and this into the first factor there. We're going to set this to 0.9, just like that, and change this to F2, Manhattan, and then scale to 4, just like that. And then we're going to come over to the right, change the color burn to 0.275, then drag this across to 1. And there we go. That's texture 27. On to texture 28. Let's start by adjusting our wave texture. Change the scale to 0.31. Then hit Control T and bring out the texture coordinate mapping node and plug object into the mapping node there. Let's go ahead and duplicate this wave texture with Control Shift D, and so it's still attached to this mapping node. And come down to the bottom here and change the scale to 1. We're going to go ahead and add a gradient onto each of these noodles after that mapping node and change the top one to radial and the bottom one to spherical, just like that. Let's go ahead and add a noise onto the vector line as well, and add a mix RGB as well as that balancing setup with the second mix RGB, and which we changed to subtract there. Let's move this up and plug object into color 2 of that first mix RGB. We're going to add any value and a math node so we can make sure that those two factors add up to 1. Change this to subtract, plug this into the bottom, change this to 1, plug this into here, and plug this into here, just like that. We're going to change this factor to 0.74. Come over to the scale on the noise and change it to 2.3. Then we're going to come over to the right and mix these two together and just leave it at 0.5. That's fine. And then drag this to the right. And there we go. We've got texture 28. On to texture 29. Let's go ahead and change the scale of this wave to 0.62. Let's hit Control T and plug object into vector there. Let's move these over a tiny bit and Control Shift D on that wave texture and change the scale of the bottom one to 1, just like this. Then we're going to add in 2 gradients on these noodles here. Change the top one to a radial and the bottom one to a spherical. Then we'll go ahead and mix these two together and just change this mix to 0.4. Let's go ahead and add a noise onto this vector line. Same kind of thing we've been doing before with those 2 mix RGBs. First one just regular and the second one set to subtract, and then we'll just move this up, plug object into color 2 on that first mix RGB, and then we'll bring in a value and a math node in order to make sure those 2 factors add up to 1. So we'll just do that, change this to subtract, and plug this into the second factor, and it's going into the first factor there. Then we're going to set this value to 0.94, just like that. The noise is going to be at 8. And come over to the right here on the color dodge and change that to 1. And there we go. We've got texture 29. Let's check out texture 30. On my wave texture, I'm going to set this to 1 for the scale. I'm going to come up here and go to diagonal and then change this to triangle, just like that. I'm going to click on this and hit Control T and make sure it's coming out of object into that vector there, and then move this over and just Control Shift D this wave texture. Let's move this down. Let's change this to Y and change this to saw. And we'll leave the scale at 1 there. Let's mix these together and change the mix factor to 0.36, just like this. Let's come down here to the right and let's just change this to 1. And there we go. We got texture 30. For texture 31, let's change the scale to 0.7 and change X to diagonal, just like this. Click on that wave texture and hit Control T and plug object into vector there. Let's just move this over here and Control Shift D this wave texture so it's still connected. Let's change this bottom one to 0.5. We'll change this to Y. We'll change this to saw. And let's mix these together. We'll change the mix factor to 0.76, just like this. Let's come over to the vector line here and add on a Voronoi. We'll just place this here, make sure it's coming out of distance. And then let's add in, this time only 1 mix RGB. Just place it right here and plug object into color 2. Then we're going to set this factor at 0.825, just like that. Let's come over here to the color burn and set this at 0.22. Then let's drag this color dodge factor all the way to the right. And there we go. We've got texture 31. On to texture 32. We'll start by changing the scale on this wave texture to 1.9 and changing this to saw, just like that. Click on this and hit Control T and make sure object is going into that mapping node. Move this over. We're going to add in a noise texture. Just put it on the vector line here and then add in a mix RGB, just like this here. And plug object into color 2. Let's change the scale on this noise to 2 and then this mix factor to 0.8. Let's come over here to the wave texture and let's Control Shift D on that guy to duplicate it while it's still attached to the mapping node. And let's mix these two guys together and change this to 0.4. Just like that. Let's move this over a tiny bit and change this bottom wave texture. We will go ahead and change this to Y and then change this to triangle, and then we'll change the scale to 0.2. Let's go over here to the color burn. Let's change this to 0.35, then change the color dodge to 1, just like that. And there we go. We've got texture 32. So there we go. That's it. That took a little longer than I anticipated, but you know, it's kind of nice to have a whole bunch of different reference images there that you can work off of and kind of modify if you want. Hope you were able to follow everything I was doing, and if not, feel free and ask me a question in the comments. You know, I don't mind talking about this stuff. So yeah, thanks for watching.